they went in thinking it's all about technology. And this is what often happens with governments, whether we are talking about governments at the city level, if you think about smart city programs, that mayors may lead, or you think about even national programs like Aadhaar, or in some cases, even things like China's social credit system. You often think of these digital transformation programs as being all about technology, just introducing digital technology, introducing the internet, access to the internet, introducing 4G, mobile penetration. That will solve the problems of whatever the society is facing. And actually, it is not as simple as that. And in fact, that is actually the wrong way to proceed.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Virtuoso, a podcast series from Founding Fuel, where we engage in conversations with thought leaders from different spheres of life on things that matter to entrepreneurial leaders. I am Anna Assisi, your host for this show. In this episode, we have Jaideep Prabhu, Professor of Marketing at Cambridge Judge Business School, University of Cambridge. Jaideep is the author of a new book, How Should a Government Be? The New Levers of State Power. In this conversation with Founding Fuel's Ramnath, he shares insights from his research and his book on how the governments across the world are using the levers of technology and what's our role as citizens.
As a journalist who has covered business and who also happened to cover a little bit of government, one of the things that I found interesting is the difference between how private businesses work and how government works, but also the way in which people look at government compared to the way they look at private sector. You have extensively studied how innovation works in private sector, and then you kind of shifted your lens to the government. And did that change the way you looked at innovation itself?
Yes, a wonderful question, Ramnath. Actually gets to the heart, in a sense, of the not only this book, but my past books and really my career, particularly over, I would say, the last 10 years or so. And so as a business school professor, I have studied businesses. I've studied large Western companies, in areas like pharmaceuticals and biotechnology, banking, things like that. That was the first part of my career. And then I became interested in emerging economies like India, where I'd grown up. And then I became very interested in not just large multinationals, but also domestic companies in countries like India or China, African economies, Latin America. So I became aware of a wider range of organizations and motives in which innovation was happening. Not just the corporate environment where innovation is very much in the service of profits and shareholder wealth. It's very much about generating new products and services or processes that give you a competitive advantage. I became aware of a whole range of organizations, small to very large, that were driven by other concerns. They were not profit driven, they were more driven by solving social problems like inequality or access to healthcare, education, etc. But they were using tools of business. And so I saw the parallels immediately, how they were organizing for innovation, how they were creating a culture of innovation, how they were motivating people to innovate. And I saw parallels. So in fact, the most interesting experience for me was when I first went to Bangladesh in 2012 and came to know very closely a very large NGO, probably the world's largest NGO, BRAC, which was originally Bangladeshi, now it's quite international, where they have applied many of the principles that you would see in large companies to addressing very systemic problems in their society from the grassroots up. Problems of health, primarily started with health, where in the 70s there were very high rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality in that country. Often children were dying of dehydration from diarrhea or dysentery. And the solution actually had been developed, a very frugal, inexpensive, ingenious solution had been developed in Bangladesh itself oral rehydration solutions, where you just have a mixture of salts. So that's how BRAC came in to solve that very specific problem. And over the years, it developed an ingenious methodology and approach, which I would consider a very major social innovation, business model innovation, healthcare innovation, where basically they identified women from villages who they would train to make this oral rehydration solution. And then those women would train mothers in that village communities. And BRAC would then monitor and collect the data on this and evaluate it. And over time, they created an army of these health volunteers in villages across Bangladesh who would not only train mothers with things like oral rehydration, but then over time they became local health volunteers, like we have in India, ASHA workers, and so on. So I became very interested in these other types of organizations doing innovation. And in some ways, that is a bit like the state. What BRAC is doing in Bangladesh, you could argue, is like what a state would be expected to do. Primary health, primary education, microfinance, social enterprise, and not just in a few villages or some districts, but the whole country. And they were doing it very efficiently, very effectively, very frugally, applying some of the best principles that we teach in business schools about human resource management, financial management, database management, learning. Even more impressively, they were a learning organization trying out new ideas, testing them often with academics in a very rigorous way, and then thinking, shall we scale this? Can it scale, or should we drop these programs? So I think that is my trajectory, where I started by looking at a big corporation, thinking that's the only place where innovation happens, and then realized actually innovation is a very broad phenomenon. It happens in all kinds of organizations, including in the public sector and including in the state. So that's how I got to it. Now, your other part of your question is like, what are the similarities and differences? And I find those endlessly fascinating. Over time, I've realized there are some very interesting similarities and some very interesting differences. And actually, I see it as a continuum. I don't see it as a radical break, that really they're qualitatively different. But the instincts of people, particularly those who work in the government, is to at least initially state that they are very different, and that things that apply in the private sector simply do not apply to the state sector. And I think that is a lazy kind of defensive strategy to take, or at least it's one that when you analyze a little bit more carefully, turns out not to be the case. So, I have done training programs for senior Indian civil servants for several years. And of course, these are extremely bright people. They're extremely experienced people. They are also very thoughtful people. They read a lot, they think a lot, they are articulate. And whenever I would do a session on innovation and present them with examples from the private sector, they would immediately say, oh, but that's the private sector. They can do things that we cannot do. And I would try and dig deeper and ask them, what do you mean by that? So they say, oh, we are very bureaucratic. We have a lot of processes. We have a lot of controls. We are, accountable to so many people. And then I would point out to them that that is also the case with large companies. Large companies are also very bureaucratic. They're also very hierarchical. People are also accountable to many different groups, their customers, employers, shareholders, society, regulators. And so, the big organization, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector, actually looks remarkably similar. Then they would say, oh, we cannot take risk and experiment, because if we fail, then, that's the end of our careers. We'll be hauled up in front of ministers or in parliament or in the press. And actually, that may be true. It may be quite extreme what happens in terms of failure. But failure is not exactly tolerated in a corporation either. There are serious consequences for you if you fail. You'll be hauled up in front of your bosses. You could be hauled up in front of shareholders during conference calls. You could be liable in the press and, of course, even in a court of law. So, that risk aversion you see in both the private sector and the public sector in large companies. You see the slowness with which things happen. There is a kind of inertia in any large organization. So I actually think that large organizations, regardless of whether they're in the private or public sector, have a same set of constraints, but they also have the same set of opportunities, which is resources. So, some multinational companies today are bigger than countries put together. Their profits and their revenue streams are bigger than the GDPs of countries. They operate across countries, so sometimes they are not even beholden to any or accountable to any national parliament or government. So they're extremely powerful and have lots of resources that can help them do all kinds of things. But many governments are equally powerful. In any particular country, the government is sovereign. It has enormous resources. They can even print money if needed. They can borrow money. They can spend. They can pass legislation to do things. And they can use their influence on society to get people to volunteer to work on programs. Like I write about the Aadhaar. We had many, many people, top technocrats, technicians from top companies in the world like Google and Microsoft worked for free for over a year on Aadhaar because it was such an important project, and it would have such an impact. So it was a very great question. I think we could spend a whole hour discussing it, but I think that cuts to the heart of my new book, How Should a Government Be? Because I think that governments in many ways are like other organizations. And so the question I pose is, how can government organizations get better at what they're doing in the way that companies have got relentlessly better at what they're doing over the last few years, using new technologies, sometimes ubiquitous technologies like digital technologies, and new forms of organization to do things faster, better, cheaper. If companies like Amazon can do that for their customers, why can't governments do the same for their citizens? That's the question that I pose. But then I also acknowledge that governments may have a slightly different role. For instance, one very interesting area of difference between governments and companies is that companies can fire their customers. They can choose who they wish to serve for their products and develop their products for. Governments cannot do that or should not do that. They need to be inclusive. They need to serve all their citizens. And particularly, they have a duty to serve those who are left out of, typically left out of social and economic processes or political processes. So that is a principle, for instance, that I think is somewhat different in government, how they can be inclusive. But some other principles that I explore, like how can governments be responsive? That's true for large companies or small companies. How can governments be experimental? This is happening with large companies all the time. They're constantly trying out new ideas, testing them, and then deciding whether to scale them or not. Another principle I explore is entrepreneurial, being proactive. Governments, I think, should be proactive, engaging early with new technologies and new players to see what the implications are for the economy and society. Companies are constantly engaging with new technologies. And then the final principle is being innovative, creating a culture of innovation throughout the organization. And this is something that companies obsess about, and now governments are also thinking very hard about.
Yeah, and there is another philosophical point that you raised early on in the book, that which I think the private sector don't face so much, but all governments do. That is the constant battle between the left and the right, the statists versus libertarians. And probably this has serious implications. In your book, you talk about the controversies around Aadhaar, the pushback from the civil society. And some of those criticism goes back to the point that you mentioned, should government be in this? How much data do we give to the government? And so on, right? How has this played out in various countries? Like you look at Latin America, you spoke about China. You wanted the book to be apolitical, but still you can't avoid politics there. Can you just spend a few minutes on how some of these debates play out in different countries, have an impact on what government can do or cannot do, or the boundaries that these debates draw around how far the government can go?
And yes, this is another area of distinction between the government and the private sector, in that you have ideology. Of course, in the private sector too, you have ideologies, but perhaps not of this nature. And of course, we see increasing polarization around the world of people who ascribe to one or other ideology. And actually, it's not so neatly down the left-right divide. I mean, I think things have become a little more complex now. It's there's identity politics,
Yes.
but nevertheless, ideology is an important issue. And I think that when we talk about the public sector and the private sector, often the ideology sort of falls into the following sort of attitudes. You might think that libertarians, people who are skeptical of the state, are generally a little more positive about the market. I think that's generally the case. They somehow are more trusting of managers in companies than they are of bureaucrats in the government. And they think that bureaucrats are typically incompetent or could be even corrupt, whereas somehow managers are very efficient and are accountable, right? And you have the opposite set of views of people on the left. Typically, the statists, are very sanguine about governments. They think government is a benevolent force. They tend to trust government and bureaucrats, and they're suspicious of corporations. I think citizens, wherever they are in a curious situation, because they are now dependent, of course, on digital technologies and digital services coming from both the private sector and the public sector. And that data is being harvested and being used. And they are in a bind, I think, because on the one hand, they need these services. Imagine, particularly during COVID, we were so dependent on Amazon, so dependent on Google, and so on. But equally, we are dependent on our states. In India, people will be dependent on Aadhaar and the public distribution system. In the US and UK, people were getting, salaries, getting income, getting support, social security, a lot of it through digital means, including digital banking. So the government often, and now with COVID in the UK, for instance, the government is exploring COVID passports, where you may do some home testing, and in order to get admission into any kind of public space like a restaurant or a concert, you would have to show that you had a recent test and or the vaccine, and that would be done digitally on a phone, and there would of course be data that they would have on you. So the question is now for all citizens and customers to think about what is the contract that they're entering into with whoever the provider is, a large company like Google or Amazon, or their government, their regional government, their city government, or their national government. Because in both cases, there is the potential to benefit from that contract, but there's also the potential to be held hostage in some way, where that typically monopoly provider will have the ability to sell your data to someone else or use it to gain insight or to develop an algorithm that learns on your data at your expense. And you are not sure about how that data is being used, what your privacy is, and the security of the data. So that's one of the big questions I raise in my book is, given that we are entering and have entered already this world of digital technologies and data, and that data is so precious to so many different people, and they are using it for all kinds of purposes. The question for us is, where should that data reside? Should it reside in your country or some other country? Should it reside on the servers of a private company, or should it be within the government control? Is it within the reach of your national judiciary to legislate, to pass laws or to decide on in cases of disputes? So these are the kinds of questions I raise. I don't know if we have an answer yet. I just raise them as things that we really need to be thinking about.
You were talking about Bangladesh and how your interest expanded when you looked at BARC. And you also talk about other government-led initiatives in Bangladesh. And one of the things that I found was it is not just about rolling out technology, but it seemed to be a broader engagement with those who use technology. How common is it for the government to look at a technology project in a broader way, where they don't just think of it as the rollout of technology, but they consider multiple stakeholders and way to serve them and look at technology as a part of a bigger system. In fact, one of the very interesting metaphors that Mr. Chaudhary, whom you speak about, uh, uh, is that the idea of Lego blocks, and also other countries which follow a similar approach to technology and innovation.
Yes. So Bangladesh is a very interesting example, very interesting case. And you're right. I don't think most countries and governments really think about technology in that broad way, and that is why I wanted to write about that particular case of Bangladesh and the UNDP-led, initially called Access to Information Program, later redubbed Aspire to Innovate, and linked to their political program of Digital Bangladesh, which was introduced probably about 10 years or so ago. I find that very interesting because they went in thinking it's all about technology. And this is what often happens with governments, whether we are talking about governments at the city level, if you think about smart city programs, that mayors may lead, or you think about even national programs like Aadhaar, or, in some cases, even things like China's, social credit system. You often think of these digital transformation programs as being all about technology, just introducing digital technology, introducing the internet, access to the internet, introducing 4G, mobile penetration. That will solve the problems of whatever the society is facing. And actually, it is not as simple as that. And in fact, that is actually the wrong way to proceed. I think that's true even in the private sector. Thinking that innovation is about technology is the wrong way to go. Often, a really successful innovation is one that starts with what is the problem you're trying to solve from the perspective of the person you're trying to help or reach, the customer or the citizen. Once you've understood the problem and you really know what you're trying to achieve, then saying what is the appropriate technology we should use and how should that technological solution be organized, to reach. And it may not actually require technology. It may not require high technology, at least the solution. So that was one of the things that I found, particularly impressive about the A2I program, was that they started, like many other operations, with the technology in mind, but very soon realized it was about mindsets, and it was about culture, it was about norms and values, and that you needed to ensure that your bureaucrats, the people who are in contact with ordinary citizens all the way down to the grassroots, people who are in the government, not just in the elites of the government, but in the mass of the government, down to what they call the union parishads, which is the lowest level of government, they have to have a mindset which puts the citizen first, working outside in rather than inside out. And that's very rare in any large organization, public or private sector. In the private sector, they may pay lip service to customer service, but often, it's all about our products and pushing our products onto you, the customer. And that's particularly true in the government. It's about our way or the highway. If you're a citizen, this is how things have been done in the government for 100 years. And whether you like it or not, you have to toe the line. But they gave them training, including something called empathy training, where they would actually go out, the bureaucrats from different departments would go to another government department and actually stand in line for a particular service like an ordinary citizen, go through the whole process, and then reflect on what was it that, what was the experience like, and could they have improved the experience? And then they would do the same thing within their own department. And they would reflect again on what they could do from the citizen's perspective to improve the service. And then they would go into designing what in the private sector we would call business process design or redesign. They redubbed government service process. and they found ways to improve the service, keeping in mind a very concrete metric, what they call TCV, or time for the citizen to get that service, the cost to the citizen, and the number of visits the citizen would make. And that became the metric by which they would design and measure all government services. So that is quite a remarkable program. You tend not to see that kind of, I would say, awareness of organizational issues, softer issues like culture, mindset, empathy, and so on. But for me, as a social scientist and as someone who works in a business school, who studies organizations, that is crucial. To the success of any innovation, you really need to have that customer centricity, that outside in kind of mindset. And you need to have this mindset of, first, we have to think about the problem we're trying to solve, then think about what are the relevant technologies. So it can't be technology for the sake of technology. It's technology pressed in the service of solving problems for people.
So what does it take to create such a mindset? Is it the time that the bureaucrats believe they have? We have 5 years to get it right versus we have to roll it out in 1 year. Are there examples from other countries? How much of what Bangladesh did is exportable?
Let's take those two. Those are two very important questions, but let's take them separately. Let's take the first one, which is, why is it that organizations, and again, I think this is true even in large private sector organizations, why is it that even if they say they wish to be outside in, if they say that they're customer centric, invariably it's not that way. It's inside out. It's our product pushed onto you. It's our way or the highway. And why is that so in government as well? And therefore, why is it that new projects, even if they're well-intentioned, new products coming from companies don't work, or new services that are being delivered by the government don't work, even if they're well-intentioned? What happens? I think it's because of this mindset. To me, it really comes back to what we were saying about Bangladesh and A2I, that in any organization, over a period of time, from where you're sitting as a functionary in that organization, as a manager, as a bureaucrat, you're looking inside out. And you are more familiar, you're closer to your products. If you're making cars, you're thinking about your cars, and then you're thinking about the customer. You have the simple fact of your product staring you in the face. And, these are things we made, our babies. We are proud of them. We think they're the best in the world. And, those silly customers, why don't they see it, And they should see it, and we'll make sure they see it, and we'll spend money to advertise it so that they'll see it. And I think in government, you have even more of that kind of attitude, which is, we're the government, we know better. And if the citizens don't see, we're well-intentioned, we have their interests at heart. If they don't see that, then, we'll make sure they see it. And, we'll pass a law that makes them do what we tell them to. And, this is probably a very deep-seated kind of approach. This is certainly the traditional approach of, the large monopolist corporation, or also of the large public sector organization. But, the world has changed. That power balance has changed. Customers or citizens can organize, they can retaliate, they can resist, they are not going to be told what to do. They want the company or the government to be an equal partner at the very least, somebody who treats them with dignity and takes them seriously. So I think it comes down to that mindset. You can do remarkable things in short periods of time if you have the right mindset. And in fact, I am not a great fan of having endless amounts of time to achieve anything, because then the work expands to fill the available time. I'm very interested in frugal innovation, and frugal innovation is not just about conserving money or energy or raw materials. It's about conserving time too. And often, time is of the essence in the public sector. You need to get things done quickly. If you think about the Indian judicial system, court cases take so long that really justice delayed is justice not done. So, I think it's mindset. I don't think it's things like time and so on. If you have the right mindset and you approach the project in the right spirit with the right method, that is starting outside in, really trying to understand the problem, spending a lot of time on the problem, the solution then tends to follow much better and more efficiently and effectively. So that's the first one. Now to your second question about how exportable are these ideas? That's a great question, and that is a very important question to ask, because I think it's a fallacy to think in the social sciences that if something works in one country, it is bound to work in the neighboring country, in the next country, because conditions can be ever so slightly different in the next country or in the next time period. And what worked in one country in one time period may not work in the other country in the next time period. So there's something about just the blueprint of the solution may not work, but then there's the implementation as well. You can have the same blueprint, but it can be implemented in a very different way. So a lot in the social sciences and in the social world comes down to implementation. So we should take with a pinch of salt anything that has been done somewhere else. Whether it has failed or succeeded, we have to think carefully. A great idea could have failed in a country at one point in time, but could be a roaring success in another country at another point of time. And that could be because the conditions are slightly different, or because it was just implemented better. You had a better team doing the implementation. Now, that said, I still think we need evidence-based policy. So seat of the pants stuff, saying that, that's not going to work here, that's lazy in my mind. If you just say, that's not going to work here because we are different. Yeah, it worked in Bangladesh, but Bangladesh is smaller than India, so it's not going to work in India. That's lazy. You've got to go beyond that and say, why wouldn't it work? And what would it take to make this idea work? So, you need to think about adapting the idea. And you've got to be open to what has been done elsewhere, because that's how you get inspiration. That's how innovation happens in the private sector. Some brilliant ideas come from very different sectors. Somebody in banking may be inspired by something that happened in automotive. An innovation in the UK financial services sector could be inspired by an innovation in the Kenyan financial services sector. So in the private sector, innovators are like magpies. They steal from everywhere. And I think in government, we should be the same thing. We should have bureaucrats who are eager to learn from other countries, from other contexts, but they should apply with caution. And that's why I have a whole chapter on the experimental state, where the point is you have to try out stuff. You could be inspired by others who have tried it out there, but try it out in your context first in a pilot. See if it applies in your context, see what needs to be adapted in your context, and then scale it. And then you have evidence-based policy. So that's my take on that second part of the question.
There is another contradiction or a conflict. On the one hand, innovation happens when the bureaucrats take an outside-in look, or when company executives do that, right? But when we look at a project like Nudge, which you talk about, the debate around there is the government, there is a kind of, it is looked at some benevolent paternalism, right? And there is a huge debate on whether Nudge is better or Boost is better, whether government can assume that they know what is right and start manipulating the choices of citizens, versus the point that you made about in Bangladesh about expanding education, increase the capacity of a population so they take the right choice, rather than someone sitting in a in Delhi deciding what is right for them. I'm not for a moment suggesting that in India, I think they use some of the nudge theories to increase toilet usage, for example, right? I'm not saying that those things are bad, but where do we draw the line? And are there any lessons that emerge out of UK's experiment?
Yeah. So I think, again, it's one idea. It's a very interesting innovation in government. And it should be a part of the toolkit of anyone in government. So I'm a big believer in tools. These ideas are all tools. One might be like a screwdriver, one might be like a hammer, one might be like a drill, one might be like a nut, like a bolt. These are tools you need to have in your toolkit, and there'll be a time when you need the screwdriver for a certain purpose, and you don't want to use the hammer at that time. At another time, you might want the hammer. So, I think governments have a whole bunch of tools. Some tools they use more than others, and really they should be thinking about expanding that toolkit and being very aware of which tools work best when. And so the whole governments, and it actually combines and is a nice middle ground between two kind of extremes. Again, if we go back to our ideology, if you have libertarians on one hand and you have statists on the other, basically they hew to two extremes. The libertarians are kind of laissez-faire, and they say the government shouldn't tell people to do anything. Government should just take people's lives, okay? And sometimes that's a good idea. Sometimes that may be foolish because there are all kinds of negative consequences of laissez-faire. On the other hand, statists will say, oh, no, the government should always intervene. Nanny state, the government should tell people what to do because people are stupid and need to be told. And of course, we can see sometimes people do behave stupidly and they need to be told, let's say like during a pandemic. But very often people, have the ability to decide and make the best decisions for themselves. And actually, in the long term, maybe you should encourage people to do that. And if you're constantly telling them what to do, you're diminishing their ability to make the right decision. So again, I see these extreme positions as actually only applicable in certain situations. They're again like tools for me. Laissez-faire is a tool. State intervention is a tool. There's a right time for each. And in between, there's a vast space. And actually, nudge falls in between because it kind of says, there is a role for the state. The state can help people make the right decisions about how they live their lives in terms of eating and healthy living and so on. But, we don't want to be too assertive. We don't want to be too prescriptive. We just want to suggest to people, look, hey, these are your options. Why don't you consider these options? And if you really want to live a healthy life, think about cutting down on, unhealthy food. Think about exercise. In a pandemic, look, you really want to be washing your hands. You don't want to be going out, So again, it's a whole spectrum. Behavioral Insights sits nicely in the middle there. There are lots of very interesting things that the Behavioral Insights team in the UK have done. So much so that group has grown very large from being a small skunk works in the cabinet office of about 5 to 10 people. It's now about 250 people. As you said, they hived it off. I think that was really interesting too. Very important move. So it's not in government. It acts as a consultant to government. It's part owned by government, but they have autonomy. It's part owned by a think tank, and it's part owned by the employees themselves. And they have spread their ideas and their model to many other countries, both at the national level as well as in the provincial or regional level. So I think countries like India could gain a lot from that. The way I see it is Behavioral Insights is another tool. And linked to Behavioral Insights is the experimental method of actually when you try out anything, you try it out in a way that you're collecting data in a systematic way. You do a kind of randomized controlled trial. So you have a benchmark, you have a basis for knowing, did that intervention work or not? And this goes back to your previous question about are ideas exportable? We'll only know if they're exportable if you have some evidence to suggest that they worked or didn't work. So I think, short answer, that's a great approach and ought to be tried elsewhere, including in India.
Yeah, that actually brings me to the question on the exponential technology, right? The emerging technology, which we haven't really, which we don't know how it'll work. Stuff like AI, self-driving cars, GM food, and you devoted several sections in your book on how do governments regulate these technologies, and since there is a significant change in the kind of technologies we are looking at today, right? And not many know what the second order consequences will be, and many don't understand the technology themselves, right?
Yeah, so this is a big area, and this is an area where governments are still the only game in town, the only organization that can regulate and pass laws about new technologies are governments, the state, and so regulation becomes very important. And as you point out, we are facing now, we're at the on the edge of many very transformative technologies materializing. We're at the cusp of things like autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, robotics, AI, GM. All these areas are really maturing now. They're going to take off, and there are huge implications for societies and economies. And the state absolutely has to be on board here, and has to be, as I say in the book, highly entrepreneurial. By that I mean the state has to be very proactive in engaging early with these technologies and the various players, because very, very many different players will be involved. There will be large and small companies. Let's take a specific example of autonomous vehicles. There are many players that will be playing in this space. There'll be large and small car companies, there'll be software companies, telecoms companies, legal and insurance companies, universities will be playing in the space, and of course citizens. And there are huge upside. There's a huge upside potential. Autonomous vehicles could reduce dramatically the number of people who die every year in road accidents around the world. They could reduce emissions tremendously, because we'd have much more efficient use of vehicles in traffic. It could reduce the amount of space needed in our cities for parking. That would free up space for all kinds of other things like parks and housing. So it could be transformative on the upside. But we can also see potential dark sides, particularly to do with employment, because large numbers of people currently are employed as drivers of cars, taxis, buses, lorries, trucks, haulage. What's going to happen to those people, to those jobs? And if they lose those jobs, what would they do? Can they easily reskill, retrain to be AI engineers and software programmers? That may not be achievable overnight. So governments have to go in early, and they have to be proactive. They have to, as I say in the book, steer and not row. They should resist the temptation from trying to do everything themselves. Equally, they should resist the temptation of being laissez-faire and saying, "Oh, the market will take care of it. We don't need to do anything." I think there are serious downsides of both, being libertarian there and saying the market will take care of everything. Interestingly, if you don't have clever regulation, the market will not materialize. It's not just about government spending on new technologies. That's the view of certain people like Mariana Mazzucato. It's about spending. Government should just spend. I don't agree with that. I think you have to do some spending, but clever spending. But more importantly, the government has to have smart regulation, has to very clearly set the rules of the game for different players to play, and also have a level playing field so that different types of companies can engage, not just the large monopolists and traditional companies. So governments have to be entrepreneurial in the sense they have to be proactive, they have to engage early. And by engaging early, they will learn with the different players. So with autonomous vehicles, I point out how different US states like California and the UK government, for instance, have done precisely this. They have gone in early, had a very clear, open kind of regulatory system policy where they said we'll allow anyone to come in and test their cars, even on public roads where there may be normal traffic. But there are certain conditions you have to comply with. You have to have the vehicle has to be registered. There has to be a human operator in the car to take over at any point. You have to collect data. You have to report on disengagements when the system is working or not, all this kind of stuff. And in the process, you will learn a lot about where the technology works, what are the drawbacks, what are the great benefits. You will learn, but you will also help us learn what we should be regulating about down the road. What are the things we need to be concerned about? When will this technology work, not work? How does it interact with existing cars on the road, pedestrians? How does it work in city roads, busy city roads, in neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods, out on the freeway? All these kinds of things. And by doing that, you stimulate industry to come in, you'll stimulate learning from industry, you get foreign direct investment, you get all these players working together. But you as a regulator also know early what are the issues to look out for and how should you formulate laws going forward that will help you achieve both, on the one hand, a thriving economy in that space, but equally things that you need to be watch out for to protect the citizen. You'll also know about what are the skills that are needed so you can ensure that the right kind of employment opportunities are created for people who might be losing employment from this new technology. So that's one of the key things. A very interesting approach, a philosophy that I am very keen on is this idea of trying out pilots with new technologies where you pilot and you practice on real customers, but in a protected space where if there are failures, the costs of failure are not systemic. And this is known as the regulatory sandbox. Yeah. Exactly. So this has been tried, very effectively in the UK with financial services, particularly fintech. So, in the UK, the FSA, which is the regulator for financial services, says to fintech companies, we'll give you a sandbox, a space where you have access to real customers. You can try out your business, and we'll see if it works or not. And if it works, great. We can then give you the license to operate. If it doesn't work, then the costs are not great. We have tried out an experiment. We have learned, but the system has not had to suffer the consequences. And that's the same approach that is being used with autonomous vehicles. We'll let you trial even on city roads, but under controlled circumstances where we protect the citizen, but you also learn about what works and what doesn't work. And I think this is a very powerful notion which really needs to be adopted elsewhere by regulators. And this comes to your second part, which is who are these people now? Who should we be having as regulators? Yes, we need to have people who are bureaucrats, who understand how the government works, how the executive works, the legislature works, all this kind of thing, people who care about, the common interest, the public interest. But we also need people who are technologically savvy and who understand how businesses work. So where I teach in Cambridge, we have, in the business school, we have a master's program called MPhil in Technology Policy, where we're actually training our students to engage with new technologies like artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, genetically modified insects, and organisms, and think about what are the likely upsides and downsides, how will industry engage with it, and having understood that, then think about what is the smart policy. How can policymakers ensure that you get all the benefits of these new technologies while mitigating any of the drawbacks? And to do that, you need to understand how the private sector thinks and works, not just within a country, but cross-nationally. And you also need to know about how technologies work. So I think that we need a new type of person in government, somebody who is an innovator, who may have worked in the private sector, so knows the mindset of the private sector very well, and then comes into government to regulate, to ensure that we get the best for the private sector, but not at the expense of the ordinary citizen.
And in the book, you say citizens have a role too, of the many things, from electing the right type of leaders. You give some pointers, the one on how they balance ideology with pragmatism. It's a question that we, in fact, started the conversation with. Can you elaborate on that? And are there ways in which citizens can effectively use technology to do this?
So, that was actually the most interesting part of the book for me, as an ordinary citizen myself, who's lived and worked in India, in the US, in the Netherlands, and now Britain. Um, I spend most of the book, 9 chapters, thinking about how the government should be. And actually, all the time, I was thinking about this from the perspective of the citizen, like myself. I would consider myself like an ordinary citizen, Aam Aadmi, as we would say in India. And really, then it struck me that no matter what we might say and want our governments to be like, really, we have a very important role to play in ensuring that the government is what we want it to be as citizens. The the government, if we think the government can improve, then how do we ensure that it does? We do that as citizens. And of course, if we are lucky enough to be in countries which are democracies, we do that by voting. And when we vote, we need to think very hard, I would say. Perhaps many of us don't vote. And even those who vote, how hard do we really do our research? If we go and buy a mobile phone or a computer, I would argue we often do much more research than when we vote. We really need to think hard about who are we voting for, not just the leader, their team. What can the team do? What are they saying they'll do? What will they do? So we need to do that. But then it doesn't stop with the elections. And when somebody wins, we have to hold them to account for what they said they would do when they came to power. And often there's a slip between what they say and what they do. So we have to hold them to it. And how can we hold them to it? We can do that by protesting, using the press, using our voice. There are many examples of protest movements. Some of these go global. You've had Black Lives Matter recently. You've had Extinction Rebellion. You've had the Me Too movement. You've had various protests that followed the financial crisis. And they spread virally. And a lot of that is happening because of digital technology, mobile phones, social media. Citizens can get together very quickly, share opinions, organize. Even in autocratic societies, they can move very quickly, which is why in autocratic societies, the state is trying to control and have a monopoly over these technologies. So there's a lot a citizen can do from outside the government. But my conclusion was that in the end, if you really care about how your government should be, perhaps the best thing you can do is to go and work in the government. And you can do that as a politician at any level. But I think more importantly, you could do it as a bureaucrat, as a civil servant. I don't know, I find there's something very noble about that role, maybe because my family are civil servants and I have engaged with many civil servants from around the world. I find that something very noble about working in your government for the benefit of all, not just for the customer of your company or your shareholder. I find it a very noble idea, and I think that we need our brightest people to actually go and work in government for the benefit of all.
Yeah. So kind of you, Jaideep, and thank you so much for your time. And I hope more people read your book, because we tend to focus too much on the country that we live in, or focus on projects that media shines the light on. But this opens up so many new things. But more importantly, the lens that you wore to look at it was fascinating. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ramnath. And actually on that point, that's also a very interesting observation. I feel that often in the press, we only hear the negative stories about government. And of course, that's the role of the press, is to hold the government to account. And one way you do it is to talk about all the things that are going wrong. But in talking to and researching this book, I realized that there's also so much that is going right in our societies and in our governments, which we don't notice and don't realize. And therefore, we might, at least speaking for myself, we often think that things are bad, but actually things are not so bad. They have been worse and they might get better.
You just heard Founding Fuel's conversation with Jaideep Prabhu. We will be back with a new episode of Virtuoso soon. To stay connected, subscribe to Founding Fuel's daily newsletter and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We are also on Clubhouse, hosting interesting conversations every week. See you